Given the history of titles covered by Comic Book Breakdown, this might surprise you, dear listener, but Marvel Comics is not my favorite comic book company. I've made clear my general lack of interest in DC, although I keep trying. I have found titles that I like at Image, Cliffhanger, and at many other companies, but not enough of them with regularity to have won my heart. Marvel has always been my main comic home. I love Marvel Comics, I honestly do, but they aren't my favorite. No. My favorite comic book company is CrossGen Comics! But CrossGen also hasn't operated since 2004, so there is a strong chance that you, dear listener, may not have heard of them. And that is a damn shame that I aim to rectify. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 18.0, my quick history with CrossGen Comics. I started buying comics in 1994 with Cable issue 16, but I don't consider my official start as a comic book collector to be until 1997, when I bought Uncanny X-Men issue 341. This is because, before that issue, I could only buy comic books rarely and largely at random. It wasn't until the Christmas of 1996, when my Aunt Cheryl got me a gift card for Comic Book City, that I started buying comic books on a regular monthly basis. That is what I consider to be my official start as a comic book collector. As much as I love having a specific shop to get my regular books from, though, my love of comic book hunting is far greater. Wherever I go, however much money I have, I am always looking for a comic book store. As a younger man, on one trip to Hills in 2000, a now-defunct department store along the lines of Target or Walmart these days, my family was pulling up to the L-shaped shopping center when I noticed a new store in the strip mall. One whose sign just said, Comics. And I had to check it out. I never knew the name of this place, and it is long gone by now, but I will always remember it. The store was tall, for one thing, which was weird. Despite being one story, I was much more used to the small, tight, cramped spaces of Comic Book City, and this place felt gigantic in comparison. CBC is also mostly wood, and has the smell of old, worn wood to it. It is a scent that I associate with comics and happiness and peace. The lighting in this new place was dark as well, and comic book boxes ran along both walls once you passed the new release books. They had one old-school spinner rack set in the middle between these long boxes, and it was at that rack that I encountered my first CrossGen comic in person. But secretly, y'all, I had known about CrossGen Comics, albeit vaguely, for years. I have always hunted for more comic books, but in those days, that was not an easy thing to do. Before the internet made industry news and gossip easily accessible to all, comic book geeks had one place to go for that kind of information, and that was Wizard magazine. I didn't buy Wizard regularly, but when I had the extra money I did, always looking for something new. I remember seeing one particular ad in it that caught my eye. It was a full-page ad made to look like a wanted poster. The image was of the back of an artist at a drafting table. A new comic company called CrossGen Comics was hiring, and they wanted you. Like, me? Like they wanted me? Well, flattering. I remember thinking maybe I should apply. I dreamed of being a comic book artist at the time, and that's an idea that I would toy with for months. But because this was just an ad, like all good Americans, I internalized it and moved on with my life. CrossGen was now on my radar, but they weren't publishing yet. After all, they were looking for artists. They still had to actually make the comics. But while CrossGen was putting its pieces together, I was graduating from superheroes to more broad-scale heroic fantasy. In 1997, my family moved, and in many ways, it feels like the world opened up to me because of that. After the move, we got cable TV, we got dial-up internet, and my avenues for entertainment and education exploded. One of the major things that I discovered were animes like Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon, Pokémon, and Tenchi Muyo. It was only a matter of time until I discovered manga, the Japanese version of comic books, and once I did, woo boy, I would go on to spend hundreds of dollars scooping up every volume of manga I could find. I had grown up reading sci-fi stories like Animorphs and the Star Wars novels, as well as fantasy books like Hickman and Weiss's Dragonlance trilogy, or Susan Cooper's The Darkest Rising sequence, or C.S. Friedman's Coldfire trilogy. As much as I loved the X-Men comics, and I loved them, they never scratched my love of just a good old-fashioned non-superhero story. Manga did, though. The topics and stories of manga vary like nothing does in the American market. GTO was about a former gang member who wanted to become a teacher so that he could marry one of his students, but he's actually too much of a nice guy to do it, and he just ends up solving everybody's emotional problems. Real About High School featured a high school that solved disputes through fight matches, and featured a lead heroine who suffered from depression. Magic Knight Rayearth saw 3 girls transported to a fantasy world where they were caught in a war using mech suits, but a war in which they stayed true to their hearts. I fell in love with manga hard, and I would be forever searching for new comic books that could scratch the itch that manga did. This was ultimately what brought me to Battle Chasers, but obviously due to its super irregular schedule, it was never able to fully enthrall me. Maybe if Battle Chasers had been a monthly book and had managed to last for a couple of years, I'd be sitting here telling you that Cliffhanger was my favorite comic book company. But that didn't happen. I would continue to buy Wizard Magazine and my monthly Uncanny X-Men for years, until finally I visited that nameless comic store in 2000 and saw CrossGen stuff for myself. Founded by entrepreneur Mark Alessi, CrossGen Comics was built to do nothing less than save the American comic book industry. Like myself, Alessi grew up reading comics, but in his day, comic books were much more multi-genre, publishing stories like westerns, fantasies, war stories, romance stories, horror stories, and sci-fi stories, alongside all of the superhero stuff that we have come to know the industry for. Superheroes quickly proved to be the hot property, though, and slowly, the other genres died out. Comic books became only about superheroes, depending on yearly crossovers to make sales just to survive. No other form of entertainment does that. You turn on the TV and there are endless genres to watch. You go to a bookstore or a library and it's the same thing with books. Movies, same thing. Manga, same thing. Sales slowed then, and continue to slow now, as the market catered less to the broad attentions of the world, and more to the singular focus of white males aged 12 to 45. Companies originally published superheroes because they sold better than everything else, sure, but now, companies just couldn't afford to publish anything but superheroes, and the market suffered for it. Financially stable thanks to the companies that he had founded before this one, Alessi spoke to comic book fans, shop owners, and industry professionals about what the industry was doing wrong, what it was doing right, and what it needed to do in order to grow. Combining those answers with his own love and passion for the industry, Alessi visited his cousin, Gina Villa, and pitched her the idea of making his own comic company. The name, CrossGen, was built on the idea of drawing their success from across generations. In his research, Alessi saw storytelling trends and themes that had always been successful, and had incorporated those ideas into his company. Although initially skeptical, Alessi won Villa over, and the pair quickly conceptualized 4 titles. These books would all share a singular universe, the CrossGen universe. They would have connections that ran through them, but each title would also stand alone. No one would be forced to buy every book in order to understand what was going on. There would be no yearly crossovers here. But if you liked one book enough, and maybe you wanted to buy a second, you could find themes and ideas running through both of them, rewarding you for your bravery and curiosity. These books would also be specifically not about superheroes. Alessi was a fan of the heroic journey, sure, and his books would feature people with superpowers, but they would not be spandex-clad do-gooders running around America or a copy of America. Alessi knew that superheroes only appealed to a small portion of the media-consuming populace, and he was looking to appeal to the world. One of the best reasons to try one of CrossGen's comics, actually, was their money-back guarantee. If you bought CrossGen Chronicles, their launch title, which set up their 4 ongoing series and hinted at things to come, plus the first 3 issues of any one of their titles, and you didn't like them, you could send them back to CrossGen for a refund. No comic company does that. Hell, almost no comic store accepts returns. You did have to include a handwritten explanation about why you didn't like their books, but hey, that's still doable, and that's still not a lot to ask, in my opinion, for a full money-back guarantee. Standing in that nameless comic book store, staring at these comic books, falling in love, it was almost too good to be true. That store had the first 3 issues of Mystic and Sigil, the first 2 of Scion, and I think maybe 1 issue of Meridian. Scion was the first book that caught my eye, its art style clearly the most influenced by manga, and featuring a young man wielding a broadsword with yellow energy crackling on it. Upon his arm was a circular symbol, almost like a yin-yang but red and yellow, and I recognized that artwork. I wouldn't put 2 and 2 together for a long time, but that artwork was Jim Cheung's artwork. Longtime listeners will know that Cheung drew the Maverick ongoing series. I bought what I could, most likely Sigil 1 through 3, so I could justify the money-back return if need be, and I read them. And sure enough, I loved them. Soon, I would go to CBC to pick up my monthly Uncanny X-Men issue, and ask if the owner, Mr. Ray, planned to, carry the CrossGen books. You have any interest in these things? He said no, but he could order them for me. Oh. I didn't know that was a thing. But yes, please. CrossGen would go on to publish a total of 17 ongoing series within its universe, several mini-series, a few one-shots, multiple trade paperbacks, an art book, 2 statues, and I would buy as much of it as I could. There was no crossover to boost sales, no variant covers to boost sales, just good, solid stories and beautiful artwork. In 2003, CrossGen evolved into CrossGen Entertainment to better reflect the aims of the company. CrossGen began publishing licensed titles like the Snake Plissken Chronicles, yes, featuring Snake Plissken from Escape from New York or Escape from LA, and R.A. Salvatore's Demon Wars. They created their own publishing imprint as well, called Code 6, which was meant to be creator-owned books like Red Star and the Crossovers. Seeing the potential in the digital market, CrossGen also pioneered a program called Comics on the Web, or COW, which readers could subscribe to, something that Marvel or DC wouldn't try to do for a number of years after the death of CrossGen. The company also released comics on DVD, and that is exactly what it sounds like. Each comic panel looks exactly like the panel from the comics, but without word balloons, which would fade in and fade out as the character spoke. These DVDs featured voice acting, somewhere like between a flash cartoon and a still image. You can actually find a lot of these on YouTube, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, to be honest. CrossGen was ahead of the times when it came to getting its comics into as many hands and hearts as possible. Which doesn't really sound particularly amazing, does it? CrossGen plans to make comics. Wow, Ben, how about that? Well, some of the most daring risks that CrossGen undertook actually happened behind the scenes. For most of American comic history, a company would hire its creative teams freelance, and they would work wherever they worked, at home, at the studio they rented, wherever. The creative teams would then send their work to the publisher, formerly through the mail or postal services, and nowadays through email. But if you were going to work at CrossGen, then you had to work physically at CrossGen Comics in Tampa, Florida. For most of its employees, this meant moving across the country, and, for a few, into the country for the first time. And while this isn't true in every case, if it helped to get his company the best people, Alessi would pay for the moving costs. Throughout CrossGen's existence, Alessi would host parties, sponsor sport outings, and even cover medical bills in a few rare places, and he would pay for it all out of pocket. But on top of that, one of the amazing things that CrossGen offered its employees was medical and dental insurance, which is a huge change from freelancing at Marvel or DC. CrossGen provided bi-weekly paychecks, another change from submitting a work voucher to the Big Two and then waiting for the pay cycle to dole you out your money. All CrossGen employees also qualified for profit sharing from all affiliated revenue streams, things like video games, TV shows, movies, your classic licensing deals, as well as equity stakes in the company. These were big, important things to the creative teams of these books. These are the kinds of things that you build a life upon. And it's why CrossGen was able to win over the staff from the bigger companies. The change to a working studio environment was certainly a big one for many of CrossGen's staff, especially those who had worked in the industry for a while. A 9-to-5 job isn't exactly conducive to the creative process. As a writer or artist, you kind of feel it when you feel it. Long-timers were used to sitting at home, wearing your comfortable house clothes. Author Mark Waid would joke that he used to write scripts sitting in his Superman bathrobe before coming to CrossGen. But many creators would cite the camaraderie that such an environment allowed as one of the best things about CrossGen. If you were stuck on a page, you could take a break, walk the building, chat with another artist, check out their new pages, or maybe talk to your writer if you were confused about something. CrossGen also provided in-building showers for the creative teams, a cafeteria staffed with food and drinks that were free to the employees, and a game room. Or you could get spooked by the ghost that haunted the building. Despite CrossGen's growth in publication, in 2003 things were looking grim for the company. Despite its product expansion and the awards won over the years, CrossGen had not managed to turn a profit. This was actually accounted for. Alessi's money was largely still tied to the company that had bought his own, and he planned for CrossGen to lose money for about the first 6 years. But he was also counting on movie and TV deals to ultimately save it. Rumors of film adaptations flew fast and often around the various properties, but they never seemed to manifest. Rumors started going around the internet that some creators weren't getting paid for their work, some of them for months at a time, and soon creators were leaving the company. All the promise that CrossGen had was burning up like morning mist in the rising sun. In 2003, CrossGen declared bankruptcy. Alessi, a lifelong collector of comic book art, sold a lot of his collection to either pay back the creators or lend money to the company in order to fight off a buyout. But unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. In 2004, CrossGen's assets were purchased by Disney Publishing, and Disney did nothing with them. This is something that's always interested me. Given that Disney didn't do anything with CrossGen, I can't help but wonder why they bought the assets. Had all of those film and TV rumors piqued Disney's interest? Were they trying to keep good ideas out of other developers' hands? I don't know, unfortunately, but for the future at least, CrossGen was no more. Until 2006, at least, a company called Checker Books licensed the publishing rights to the CrossGen comics. They picked up publishing the trade paperbacks, where CrossGen had been forced to stop. They did publish more collected material, but they did not publish anything new in 2008. Now wait, Disney owns the rights to CrossGen, yes? And didn't Disney buy Marvel Comics in 2009? Why not have Marvel publish the books, or maybe even bring them back? Well, Marvel tried, and they did publish 3 miniseries based on Sigil, Mystic, and Ruse. 2 of them were pretty much utterly unlike the source material, while the third was a pretty good redo. Sales of those books were unimpressive, though, and Marvel never followed up with anything more. And as much as I love CrossGen, I'm okay with that. I have been watching Marvel try to resurrect dead titles, concepts, or publishing lines all of my life, and they almost always suck. I can appreciate what CrossGen was and what it meant to me without attempts to Frankenstein it. Sometimes you just have to accept that death happens and move on. Although, I won't lie, it hurts my soul to see their various titles in dollar bins these days. But, maybe that means some other kid with a budget will discover them and get to love them too. You gotta stay hopeful. I actually think that CrossGen's death is one of the reasons why I still love it so much. With Marvel or DC, most of their concepts have been published since the 1960s, so they've been forced to grow and change with the times. That means multiple writers, artists, and interpretations, and while I think that's one of the strengths of the American comic book market, the ability to take a solid idea and update it for the modern times, whatever they be, I also think that it's one of the industry's greatest weaknesses. Because if you don't like a writer or an artist or a particular era, you might just stop buying that book completely. But with CrossGen, the company only lasted for 4 years, and it died just as their first big status quo changing story was happening. I only have to remember the good times about CrossGen, because CrossGen never lived long enough for things to get bad. Undoubtedly, one of my favorite things about the entire CrossGen experience was their message boards. Like I said, my family had just gotten dial-up internet when I discovered CrossGen, and I would soon spend hours online debating theories, critiquing the books, and just having a wonderful time. Surprisingly, CrossGen staff members would sometimes get on the board and post as well. This was fairly rare, but it did happen. I remember colorist Laura Dupuis tearing us a new one for bashing the new cover of the first Rouge trade paperback. The original cover was more of a movie poster style image featuring a lot of images that reflected the story of the arc and, in my opinion, better reflected the artwork of the arc. The new cover just featured our 2 lead characters, our main villainess, and it kinda looks like a Victorian fashion magazine cover. But Dupuis had digitally painted it, which was a fairly new technique back in those days, and in her defense, it does look great. It's a good-looking cover. I know that I preferred the original one, and seemingly so did a lot of other people on the boards. But when we started crying about it, Dupuis came online and she tore us a new one. I felt so bad. I still cringe at that experience, but overall, the boards were wonderful. Like I said, I spent about 4 years interacting on these boards as much as I could for hours of a day, just refreshing the page, hoping for a new comment, hoping for a new idea. It was just such a cool community. I loved CrossGen's website, too. They had a cute navigation system where you were looking at the galaxy that represented the CrossGen universe, right? And each planet in that galaxy was a planet in the comics, and clicking on it would take you to information about that book, like the creative team and the cast and what had been going on, and they had regular release dates for each book posted monthly, on time, something that Marvel certainly never did. Timeliness was something that Alessi was particularly proud of. I believe Marvel's The Ultimates was kind of a reviewer's dream and a comic book industry darling at the time, but it was so frequently late that they might still be publishing issues of it today. I don't think I've checked in a while. If I remember correctly, CrossGen never missed a ship date. The only time that they were late was because the company who printed their books failed to print on time, not because CrossGen failed to deliver their files on time. CrossGen did everything that it could to produce a quality product on time, appealing to as wide a fan base as possible, using top-of-the-line technology while still taking care of its employees. And it simply wasn't enough for a variety of reasons. I discovered some of my favorite writers and artists during the lifespan of CrossGen, though, as well as a whole host of characters and stories that I love. Now, I'm painting this picture with the rose-colored glasses of pure love, but I do want to be clear. While Mark Alessi founded CrossGen, and it was definitely shaped to his vision, that doesn't mean that he was a saint. Interviews with authors after the fact would reveal that Alessi was very opinionated, and he expected to be listened to. This was his company, and he was signing the paychecks, thank you very much, and if he didn't like your page, then you need to redraw that page. Authors Mark Waid and Ron Marz have been very open about their arguments with Alessi and how verbally abusive he could be as a boss. The bankruptcy was also very damaging to the staff, nearly ruining some people. Marz himself said that he was, quote, left holding the bag for about $4,000, end quote. Alessi did an interview with the Dollar Bin podcast in 2016, and listening to him, he seems like he was a very no-nonsense, confident, possibly arrogant man. I can believe those encounters that Wade, Mars, and other creators said that they had with Alessi. Alessi also has his own complaints with some of his detractors, so the problems go both ways. In a CrossGen special released by Wizard Magazine, Wade stated that the art teams would often work 60 hours a week, if not more. This isn't terribly unique in the American comic book industry. A comic page takes as long as it takes. That's why artists tend to get paid by page and not by the hour. But I want to make it clear that for as much as I love CrossGen, it was not a paradise, and it was not a utopian community. CrossGen, like all places, was a business. And there was some crap going on behind the scenes. I love CrossGen, and I will always love it, but it's not perfect, and I'm willing to admit that. I've held off talking about CrossGen this long because I wasn't sure about the best way to talk about its comics. I read each of these ongoing series as they were coming out, and like I said, CrossGen published up to 17 ongoing series, and due to the interweaved back nature of these comics, you kind of discover things about one book that reveal the way something's working in another book, which reveals the way something's working in another book. So, do I talk about everything all at once? And if I do, when do I stop? That's like a mission for the next 7 years of my life. I don't know how you do that. Well, each book is meant to be a standalone, right? That is literally one of the selling points of the company, that each book can be its own thing, but that they complement each other. So, for the ease of the breakdown, it makes the most sense for me to just cover one series at a time. So I'm picking my teenage self's favorite, Scion, and I'm going to start there. I figure that I'll cover the first year, meaning the first 12 to 13 issues, which should mean about 6 episodes, and then I'll gauge how I feel from there. Either I'll end up doing a palate-cleansing mini-series in between, or, if I'm feeling it, I just may keep talking about Scion. Join me in a week as I return to my favorite comic book universe and the high-tech medieval world of Avalon in Comic Book Breakdown episode 18.1, Scion. High fantasy meets high tech. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.